We are a community of Christians who love Jesus and love technology and want to see how those kind of two things intersect in our lives and just think about that and discuss it. We're a community. We love to kind of get to know each other and share ideas about what it looks like to work in this space and be a Christian. We also hear from wonderful people like Jimmy Lawrence, who's going to come and speak to us tonight about the fourth industrial revolution of technology and what that has to play into our faith and what that looks like from a kind of theological perspective. I'll kick off with some prayer and then I'll introduce Jimmy and we'll carry on. So, Lord, thank you so much for this evening and bringing us together, Lord. We love you and we want to think more deeply about what it means to be Christians and technologists and bringing all that stuff together. Lord, I pray that you just bless this evening, that we would be inspired, that you would speak to us, and that it will really build us up to go back into our contexts in our workplaces to give you glory and to bring you into our work and everyday, God. Amen.
Thank you very much, Al. So, I'm not really a techie, although based on the last Kingdom Code event I came to, I'm committing myself to learning how to code. I'm going to start that after I've written my master's dissertation, because that's taking up all my spare time at the moment. So what got me interested in tech? I'm as an amateur, I'm interested in consumer tech, and that was probably my way in. But then as a kind of budding theologian and wanting to think more about how the church talks to culture, I found myself really being interested by the relationship between technology, technoculture, and the wider culture in which we live. And I'm hoping to spend a good chunk of my life talking to the church and helping the church think about technology and culture. And so I come at this more as a vicar and more as someone who's interested in anthropology and culture and sociology than as a tech guy. And so that's going to impact the stuff I'm talking about and how I get from here to what can we actually do as coders? What can we actually do as people creating tech? And what are the things we need to be aware of as people in the tech industry? So I hope I will get there eventually, but that's really not where we're going to, start. Let me give you a sense of the plan for today. So we're going to start by exploring a framework. This is a framework that I got from an N.T. Wright book. Tom Wright used to be the Bishop of Durham and is a fantastic theologian, one of the premier theologians of our generation. And in the first book that he wrote on his Origins of the People of God series, the New Testament and the People of God, he has this framework which what we're going to basically spend our time over the next 40 minutes doing is taking that framework and applying it to different parts of culture. And I think this framework gives us real tools and clues on what we as technologists need to do and the sorts of questions and thoughts we need to have. So we're going to outline the framework, and that's going to lead us into looking at some cultural stories, some of the stories that our culture tells. And then having done that, we're going to look at some more kind of techno-focused stories. And then we're going to finish by looking at the gospel story and asking, what does the gospel story, what does that story raise as questions for us as we're thinking? So that's where we're going to land really with technology. I wouldn't be surprised if your experience of this evening is kind of like talking to a fish about water. You go, yeah, of course, this makes perfect sense, but I hadn't seen it like that until you described it. So if you get a lot of like, yeah, obviously, but, oh, I see, I hadn't realized that was a thing, then that's often the way it feels when talking about culture. And my assumption is that technoculture is a subset of a broader culture, and so the narratives kind of all flow in the same direction. And once we start getting our heads around these things, it all starts to make more sense. Does that make sense? Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, so here is Tom Wright's framework. He is talking about worldviews, talking about the way a culture views the world, which is what a worldview is. And he says there are 4 elements to any good worldview. And around the edge of that worldview are praxis, questions, and symbols. So by praxis, I mean the things that we do, the behaviors, the things that we do almost without thinking. That's our praxis. The questions are about origin and destiny. Who are we? Where have we come from? What's our identity? Where are we going? What's the good life look like? Those kind of key questions of identity. And then at the bottom, the symbols of that worldview. The images or the statues or the objects that just encapsulate the thing that we're talking about. And in the center of those 3 things is stories. Are stories that kind of wrap all of those things up together and deliver them to your brain in a nice, beautiful bundle that you can absorb without even thinking about it. And stories are like crack to our minds. We love them, they're addictive, they're tasty, and they give us everything we want. It's really easy to tell someone a story. And my hope is that by the end of this evening, you're going to walk out of this place going, that's a cultural narrative. That symbol is actually embodies a cultural narrative. When someone answers that question in that way, they're actually referring to a narrative that changes the way they live. So holding these 4 things together, if I've changed anything from N.T. Wright, it's that I've put story in the middle like that. I think he just has it as a box, but I wanted to make the point that story kind of holds these things, and they link so that they're all touching, and they kind of overlap just these categories become very loose, and that will become clear as we're talking. So let me give you an example of symbols that hold a cultural narrative, and that these cultural stories should feel very familiar. Who can tell me what that's a symbol of? Who knows what that statue is? Churchill. Churchill standing outside the Houses of Parliament. How do you feel with these symbols? Churchill, the bulldog, and poppies. These are symbols of a cultural narrative that our culture is talking about all the time. And a certain section of our culture loves these symbols and sees the story that they live in within this symbology. We won the Second World War, the Great War, and it was a war that made sense in narrative terms. We knew who the bad guys were, and we knew who the good guys were, and the good guys won. And we won it through dogged determination, and we kind of hunched our backs, and we went and we plodded forward, and we kept going. So the red poppy is about remembering the British bulldog spirit. And that cultural narrative is very different to the symbol of this cultural narrative. And they do not blend. And one of the big conversations we're having as a culture at the moment is around these 2 narratives clashing. Do you see how symbol feeds into a worldview? Let's do praxis. So the things that we do every day without even really thinking about them, the stuff of life that we just take for granted. What do the praxis of these 2 symbols, what's the story that is immediately invoked as you think about people commuting to work in the masses being squeezed like sardines into work, or people sitting in grey, faceless boxes. There's a story there being told by the things that we do day in, day out. And it's a very different story to this, to the praxis that leads this story forward. I don't even need to tell you what these stories are. You can see them, and you can see them in the colours. But interestingly, they both involve people on marches. Just one is a group of people on their way to work, and another people are celebrating their pride. These are cultural narratives being displayed through the doing of certain actions that we almost take for granted. Why would it be that a community in our culture who want to celebrate pride choose to walk together? What is that saying? Why is that a praxis, an action that is worth them doing and feeling pride in? So we've done symbol, we've done praxis. Let's do another one. Questions. The questions of origin and the questions of destiny. Where did we start and where are we going? The questions around creation and evolution, the interesting stuff in that conversation is not around which one is factually accurate. That's not as far as I'm concerned, that's not the interesting bit in that story. I personally think that evolution is factually accurate, but that's not the point of this story. It's about where did we come from, and where does our origin, what does that teach us about who human beings are and where they're going one day and how they were made. It's a cultural narrative that's being played out in one form or another, and it gets kind of if you think this is a story about facts, if you think this is an issue of carbon dating, you've misunderstood the real point of why it's a big deal. What about this? This is about destiny. Are we heading towards a utopia or a dystopia? And those really are the only two issues when you talk about cultural narratives. And that's, I think, part of the problem with our culture at the moment. This might be a little deep for a Wednesday afternoon, but we've all had a beer, so we're probably friends. If I described a family member to you, let's make it deeper than that. If I was talking to you about my dad, and I said, he's my hero, he's a devil, he's the best thing that's ever happened to me, he's awful. I love a love-hate relationship with your father. If you were a psychologist talking to me, you go, you've got some issues with your dad that you probably need to work through. Because almost without exception, our dads are good enough, are fine but not great. They're human beings that make mistakes and they try to do their best. They kind of bumble along in that middle ground. And when we think about our future, and all we can see with regards to a technological future is utopia or dystopia, the options are Terminator 3 or give me some utopian future, technological, anything from Apple, a kind of utopian future. If those are the only two options you can see, you've probably got issues, like my daddy issues. So questions of origin and destiny, if they fall into those two categories, you've got problems. And then finally, this is a cultural narrative that I see played out all the time. It's the narrative of the self-made man. I'm the entrepreneur. I'm the one who got nothing and worked my way up from the ground, pulled myself up with my bootstraps. This is a story of origin and destiny. This is where I came from and this is where I'm going to. And it feeds into a larger cultural narrative. So, first question. In your groups, talking to the people around you, choose a symbol, a praxis, or an identity question that is important to you and discuss it in your group. Does that make sense as a question? Understand? I appreciate it's not an easy question to answer, but does it, you understand the... Perfect. Okay. Talk to the people. We've got maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Talk to people around you and we'll go from there. So I'd love to. I would love to just at this stage get a sense of where each table's discussion took them, and then I'll plow on the material, and then because it needs to turn into a discussion, but I've got stuff to say, and so we'll slowly fold this into a larger chat. But we could just have one person, the extrovert on each table, to say what has been, what kind of summarise what your tables were talking about. Go for it, John.
I did speak first on our table, so
it's always the extrovert.
We talked about the bulldog and Brexit. We talked about that linked into, where did we go next? We got to dystopia. Oh, and millennial kind of generations. The feelings of the baby boomer generation, the self-made man. That's right. That's where we got to next. That kind of like, well, if you did, live post-war, got a house, got a job, earned well, got a comfortable way of life. Like, of course, the narrative was I did this myself. Like, I worked hard, and this is what happened. And then we've got a generation coming through who are like, well, I've worked hard, and that hasn't happened for me.
Yeah.
And
most
who's entitled in that situation?
Graduated in the middle of the financial crash.
Yeah.
Graduated into a jobless market. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and we were talking about this recently, actually, and a guy, in the discussion I was in, just said it feels like I've just been lied to. I was told work hard, meritocracy, and it's just not happened. It's a complete lie. So I mean that's quite a big generational pain and quite a big kind of big difference, big divide.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And what else? Is that a fair summary? Oh yeah, questioning our own narratives.
Questioning our own narratives, like if you're one side or the other in your story that you've grown up with, or it's part of your identity, and trying to understand the other side and realising that maybe your story is missing some bits, and maybe needs to be adjusted slightly to because there's some value in the other story, if you like. Also worth noting was the best analogy, the Star Trek versus Mad Max.
Yes.
As the utopia versus dystopia.
Perfect.
That is, which I thought was worth highlighting.
Yes.
Top notch. Top notch allegory. Yeah.
Great. Next table.
We were talking about the way we engage with these devices, how almost automatic it becomes for us in terms of how we live our lives and what it says about us, and how James was saying about he can't navigate the city he's in. This opens up services by just touching it. It tells you where to go. It tells you who's trying to get a hold of you, and how completely pervasive it has become, how all-consuming almost in such a small space of time. I was talking about a conference I was at recently that the Beano had done some research into children, and one of children's top concerns was their parents' use of phones, whereas sort of like we would see reported, parents, you should be concerned about your kids' use of phones, but actually the kids are concerned about how much their parents are using technology rather than engaging with them. And actually, does this praxis start to become an identity? What happens if you haven't got your phone, if you leave it at home?
Yes.
How much does that restrict who you are and how you can interact with people?
Yes. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but a theologian called Jamie K.A. Smith, really worth looking into. He's written a series called Cultural Liturgies, and the first book, Desiring the Kingdom, talks about how every habit is character forming. There's no such thing as a non-character forming habit, and that is why, talking from an Anglican context, liturgy should form people. By doing the peace every week, you should be becoming a person as part of a people of peace. That's why we do liturgy, because those habits should be forming us and shaping us. And one of the questions we haven't quite reached, I even talked about really, is the habit of staring at a piece of glass for 4, 5, 8 hours a day. how is that forming character and shaping persons? Jamie K.A. Smith, Desiring the Kingdom, superb book. Yeah, next table.
We drifted into talking about group relationships and the way in which that is changing. That there is a value of loyalty to the group, the practice of group friendship and loyalty, and the challenge that new media give us in, and the problem of curating persona, particularly, and the complexities of that in this ever more complicated set of relationships that we build.
Yes, very good. Let's keep going. We started by talking about, by essentially looking at culture, things that maybe we take for granted in culture, and drawing from that a set of narratives that we can go, oh, I can see the story that's being told here. The kind of key pivot at this point is to say that it's not just cultures that tell stories, but stories generate cultures. It's not just cultures that tell stories, but stories generate cultures. The story that you tell as a family generates the sort of family culture that you will have. So that again, or getting a bit deep again, but if you have a story in your family of boys don't cry, or we don't lose, or to fail is shameful, that story will generate a culture within the family where certain things are no longer allowed and other things have to be achieved. So I'm interested in what are the stories that our culture is generating, and what is the culture that's being generated by those stories. So we're going to have some fun now. I want us to look at three important stories in our culture and try and work out what's the culture that's being generated by them. So the first one, shout when you guess it. And we're going to do that. We're going to use the same model. So what are the symbols of Star Wars? What's the origin and destiny questions of Star Wars? And what's the kind of the key praxis within Star Wars? To my mind, the key symbol in Star Wars is the lightsaber. It says everything about the film. It's literally a beam of light in the darkness, and it's used to kill things. But you get, and the other thing about this kind of light-dark motif that runs throughout the story of Star Wars is you have definite bad guys and definite good guys. You're either in the light or you're in the dark, and you can go from one to the other. But there's this kind of yin-yang approach, and I don't know why, I'm sorry it's cut off a little bit at the side there, but this yin-yang approach that comes from light and dark motifs. And before you say it, the latest two films, part of the controversy of those two films is that they tried to muddy these waters. The directors tried to confuse the narrative or complicate the narrative precisely because they saw this as an issue. They said there's no such thing as simple, straightforward, light or dark. Let's try and be a bit more. Let's try and subvert that narrative, and the fans absolutely hated it. So these, I think, are the key symbols in that story, and they are already starting to open up avenues into answering the question: what are the questions and what are the actions of that story? One of the key actions is to detach yourself from the world. You know, the key to staying in the light is to not get involved, is to purify your emotions by not feeling, not loving, not being angry, and until eventually you come away from the material world altogether, and that allows you to enter into this Obi-Wan Yoda space. So that's where we're heading to, hopefully, That's seen as a vision of the good life, is detaching yourself from the physical until you're just a spiritual being, living in the light. Where did we come from? Well, we came from this utopian vision of the Republic that was destroyed, and now our job is to get back to that place. Star Wars is a very binary view of the world. Good guys, bad guys, and the way to win is to let go. This, I think, is a kind of Disneyfied Star Wars version of a kind of Eastern worldview. And actually, if you read Lucas's material on this stuff, he was trying to blend samurai fighters with Star Trekkers. Well, excuse me, invoking Star Trek in this context, Star Wars. But you know what I'm saying. He was deliberately trying to do this. Next. So it's pixelated, but this is the Hunger Games. Absolutely. I think the key symbol in the Hunger Games is this mockingjay, kind of phoenix from the flames. We will rise from the ashes of civilization and build something new. But there's another key symbol in the Hunger Games, and it's every time Katniss Everdeen does this. And what does this represent? It's a we will resist, we will rebel. Go deeper into this idea. What's the origin of the Hunger Games story? And it's a corrupt and broken system that oppresses people through insisting that they offer up a tribute once every year for these games. And Katniss Everdeen says, I will not be part of this system anymore. I will not allow my sister to be taken in by this system, and I'm going to object. And then she spends the rest of the film making these symbols and trying to tear down this broken and corrupt symbol. President Snow, again, deliberately, because he's corrupt as they get. He's Blackheart, and he's called Snow, and he's always in white, and he lives in these beautiful white mansions, but it's obviously a twist on reality that he is a black-hearted man, and at the center of it all is a single woman who stands against a corrupted institution and says, we will not have it. Stories generate cultures, and as John was saying, this is a really important story for millennials, for people in their 30s and lower, who go, this system is broken. I don't want to be part of a system where, I mean, I wrote them down on the train. In banking, politics, in the church, in media, and in the university system, we have had major crises in the last 10 to 15 years where the key figures in each of those systems has been shown to be, in some sense, President Snow, either through well, you can remember those stories. Let me say them again. Banking, politics, church, media, and university. Corruption at the heart of each of those institutions. And a generation of people are now telling themselves this story. The system is broken and corrupt. We need to stand up against the system and rebel. And like a phoenix from the flames, we'll smash this thing down and build something new. Do you see, we could look at just cultures and say, what are the narratives in culture? Or we can look at the stories that are being told and say, what are the cultures that those stories are generating? One more. Lord of the Rings. The key symbol, I think, Lord of the Rings, would be the ring of one, the ring of power, the ring that rules them all. And you get two, I think, equal and opposite symbols, which are at one end of the journey, Mordor, the place of death and destruction, and this other key symbol which returns again and again in The Lord of the Rings, the Shire. And again, you get a bit of this utopia, dystopia, you know, where have we come from, the place of perfection. And in our naivety, we're ripped out of that and sent on this journey. But it won't be a surprise to anyone here. Tolkien had was a Christian and used this set of stories to kind of portray a Christian worldview, and I think one of the ways he does that is in the person of Gollum, who is representative of the way power corrupts. And so Gollum, holding the ring for all those years, just collapses in on himself as a character. His character is entirely destroyed by the power that he carries and the power that corrupts him. And so throughout the film, you see people talking about power and the way it can corrupt, and some people giving into that and some people not giving into that. So the origin and destiny questions of the world is intrinsically good, and yet it is corruptible, and it has been corrupted in places. And there are brokenness and then praxis. I thought about this for a long time. What is the praxis? What is Tolkien telling us to do through this story? And I want to suggest one of the things he's telling us to do is to walk, is to plod. And I don't know Tolkien as a writer that well, but it strikes me that he could be saying that one of our jobs as human beings in the world is to walk through it faithfully, steadily, keeping going to our destination. The whole book is about two hobbits walking, but with a mission, doing a job, trying to keep themselves safe from the power that corrupts. And the other thing, and this got memed to death, and you couldn't hardly see it there because of the pixelation, but I wonder if another thing that Tolkien is encouraging us to do through this story is to laugh. I think, and if you can remember that scene at the end, and like I say, it got memed to death because it was ridiculously filmed, but the power of laughter and the power of friendship and fellowship to hold you as you're walking in such a way that the power can't corrupt you. I wonder if that is the narrative that Tolkien was trying to portray, and I wonder what cultures are generated from those narratives. I'm not the first person to say this, but I'm convinced that it's true that the Western world as we currently know it is the way it is, has been shaped the way it has been by close to 2,000 years, 1,500 years of the Christian narrative being at the center of that culture. So the reason we care about the poor in the way that we do, the reason we care about justice and inequality and mercy in the way that as a culture we kind of assume those things is not to be assumed if you look at other cultures around the world and other cultures in history. And the reason it's the way it is in our culture is because we've been telling the Christian narrative again and again and again for long enough that it's certain aspects of it have bedded into the culture. Now, here's the problem with my talk so far. I have been asked to do a talk on tech, and so far I've only talked about culture. And it's at this point that we're going to take all the tools that we've learned and apply them to some tech stories. But I don't know that you've seen these tech stories because they're not as famous as the ones we've been going through so far. So hence the difficulty in this talk. Here are 3 superb tech stories, and each of them have symbol and praxis and origin and destiny story questions embedded in them, and I think they're a fascinating window into the sort of cultures that are being generated in the West at the moment. And as an aside, part of the research for this whole talk has been off the back of something I've spent the last 3 years in my parish doing, which was going into a secondary school and talking to the sixth formers about cultural narratives. And the kind of cheesy pun that I hooked everything on was looking at the world through the lens of cinema. I'm free to do pun work if you ever need it. And so we would watch 30 minutes of a film in an hour's long lesson. We'd watch 30 minutes of a film, and then we'd talk about these sorts of questions. What is the story trying to teach us or tell us to do, or what big questions is it raising? Fascinating to do that with a bunch of ordinary school kids for an hour a week. So the film on the right is the is kind of representative of the cinematic universe. The latest phase of that is just finished in the final 2 films that someone's going to have to help me remember the names of. Infinity War and Endgame, thank you. And the central character in that film is Iron Man. And Iron Man's power is essentially he can create whatever he wants out of technology. He just uses technology to create whatever he needs. And he is the first person in the film, and he's the last. Does anyone care if I spoil the film? Spoiler alert. His death at the end of Endgame. I know. His death at the end of Endgame is kind of the climax of the whole series. And there's a fascinating conversation, not with Iron Man, but with Thor, who's a Norse god who's in this cinematic universe, and he's talking to Natalie Portman, and he says, in your world you call it science, in my world we call it magic, but it's the same thing. And I just want to lodge that in your brain, and we're going to come back to that as an idea later. Top left is a film called Her with Joaquin Phoenix in it, and it's superb, beautifully filmed, really worth seeing. It's about a guy who is lonely, and he falls in love with his operating system. So this is him downloading the operating system. It's got Scarlett Johansson is the voice in it, and it's worth seeing the film just for Scarlett Johansson, who isn't even in it, but her voice is like butter, and it's amazing. She is, and they build an entire relationship. He is acutely aware throughout the film that she is an operating system. She's AI. She's not actually there. She's not even a person, and he still falls in love with her. We had an amazing conversation in the school about this film, where I'd never even thought about this, but I was talking about exploitation and saying, isn't it terrible that that someone could abuse technology in this way? And one of the kids turned around and said, "Sir, that's a supercomputer. It's 1,000,000 times more intelligent than he is. He's the one being exploited." Incredible idea, but stories generate narratives. Narratives generate cultures. What is it that our culture is thinking about in that film? And then at the bottom, Ex Machina. Again, beautiful film, well worth watching. It's about the creation of a person. Can you create a person robotically? And has anyone heard of the Turing test? Have we all heard of the Turing test? Sorry? Yeah, so the Turing test, set up by Alan Turing, the father of AI. He says if you walk into a room and there's a computer there and you start typing and something is responding to you, if you're not sure whether that person is if the thing responding to you is a person or a robot, then it's passed the Turing test. And the Turing test was the kind of base of AI. So when you're trying to talk to Vodafone and you get talking to a chatbot, that's this sort of Turing test thing, except it's obviously a chatbot, and we haven't passed it yet. But this guy says, Turing test, that's nothing anymore. I don't want to know if you are confused about whether this is a computer or a person. I want you to know, can you fall in love with it? Knowing that it's a robot, can you fall in love with it? So I think our culture is trying to ask some interesting questions there about tech. And so I'd like to ask you this question. I keep doing that, getting the wrong laptop. What is your favorite film and why? What are the key symbols, origin and destination questions? And what does the film encourage its watchers to do? And if you've got a tech film, that would be particularly helpful. Try and make it modern, because we're talking about contemporary culture. No offense, but let's not have Casablanca. You've got another 5 minutes.
So which bit can you
Right, while people are just grabbing drinks, I'd love to hear conversations you've been having. Could we have again someone from each table just shout out what have you been talking about in your groups, and then we've got one final section, and then we're done, and we'll just break into chat for the rest of the / Q&A. Go on, Lawrence. Do you want to share what's?
We couldn't think of a film, but we talked about Black Mirror.
Yes, I was going to. Yeah.
Is it 50 Million Merits? Is that
Has everyone seen Black Mirror?
Yeah, 50 Million Merits episode of Black Mirror where you work in a cycling a bike for points.
Yeah.
And that's your life.
Yeah.
That sort of utopia of tech sort of making all of the work pointless.
The other one I was thinking about with Black Mirror is Wish You Were Here, where a woman loses her boyfriend and a AI software company offers to download his digital footprint into an avatar so that she can continue her relationship with him, and she does, and then it develops into this, well, as with all Black Mirror things, into this horrible dystopian world. Charlie Brooker is a twisted man, but he's brilliant, isn't he?
Brilliant.
He's absolutely brilliant.
We discussed a lot of tech stories tend to either go with the utopia or the dystopia.
Yeah.
Either you get the sort of Luddite-ish view that technology is going to destroy us and we're going to... I mean, which is just a continued narrative of the sort of nuclear holocaust story, which is all technology really. But it's that idea, or you get the sort of technology is going to fix everything and make everything okay again.
Absolutely.
So the stories tend to go in those either of those directions, like you were saying.
Yes.
It's either technology is going to fix us as a human race and we're going to reach the singularity and become disembodied.
Yes.
Not with midichlorians, but with some sort of digital
Yes.
thing. Same basic premise, right?
Yeah.
Or we're going to die in a fire and the robot's going to rule us all.
Yes.
Which I, for one, welcome a robot or
Yeah. And I think as a general rule, both as a pastor, but then just as human beings, if you're talking to someone and they're thinking in binary terms about this is either amazing or it's awful, that should be a red light for this person has got a disordered relationship with whatever that thing is. And theologically, we're talking about idolatry. That's where I would want to go if we were just talking in theological terms. But yes, pastorally, psychologically, and culturally, if you can only see dystopia or utopia, this person is amazing or they're awful. You know, red light, this person has a disordered relationship with whatever that thing is.
But a middle of the road story doesn't make for good TV.
No, it doesn't make for good TV. That's true.
No.
Yes.
So we ended up talking a little bit around films like iRobot, which has influenced quite a lot of technology we've got now. Tap to pay thanks to iRobot, but kind of thinks one of the big themes that run through that is what does it mean to be human, as so many of these kind of tech things do. Awful. You've then got kind of TV series like Orphan Black, which is around the science of cloning, which is maybe a little bit more out of our box, but you're again coming like, actually, what is humanity? What does it look like if I've been cloned? Am I human? And this robot is acting in a human way, actually, what am I human? How does this work?
And the job of, I think one of the jobs of sci-fi and fantasy is to sandbox ideas that are relevant today. So we talk about because you create a framework and then you explore an idea, but they're always pulled into relevance today. And so the question of what is it to be human has real world impact on the refugee crisis and the way we make our tech in China and Japan and North Korea and South Korea at the moment, and the really important questions about what is it to be human, what is it to have real human value and worth. Go on, next group. I was going to say something else, but I can't remember. Oh yes, Asimov's 3 laws. From iRobot. You know Asimov's 3 laws? Someone else is going to have to help me quote them, but it's something like a robot will never kill a human. A robot will never. Can someone quote them straight off the top?
It's no robot will never allow a human to be harmed.
Yes, and then a robot will never harm themselves unless it breaks laws 1 and 2.
Yeah.
The UN recently put out a set of 5 laws based in for dealing with robotics, and it was based on Asimov's 3 laws. I was at a tech conference in Durham a couple of weeks ago, and they showed us the UN's 5 laws, and as a group we went, is that not what Asimov said, but slightly more? And they were like, yeah, it was pretty much, yeah, what Asimov said. Next 2 tables, anything you want to add to the conversation, or we'll plow on?
I suppose one of the things I mentioned was, again, television series Humans, which is probably similar.
Yeah.
I think the thing for me that came out of that was how that actually almost puts a mirror back onto humanity, which I think kind of talking about a little bit in the sense of once the robots become self-aware, people fear them and they become other. So it's not about what unites us, it's about what divides us, and suddenly you see the prejudice, and it's sort of kind of, yeah, but that's happening anyway. So it's about that whole thing of take something abstract, or take something that's science fiction, but use it to actually go, yeah, but you're doing this now, this is what we're doing to other people.
Yeah.
So yeah, listen to what you
Yeah, perfect. Brilliant.
We also looked at years and years, because that's actually telling a different story trajectory. It's a descent into dystopia, but the last episode has got this big turnaround where it uses tech and activism to turn it around and defeat that system. So it's very interesting to see a story narrative where tech is actually part of the solution.
Yeah, fantastic. Very good. I didn't share with you my 3 things for... if I was to kind of just analyse this very quickly in terms of symbols, questions and praxis, I think one of the key symbols in these films and in our culture at the moment, our tech culture at the moment, is the screen. It's the interface. And it's fascinating. I don't have this slide here, but if you look at mobile phone design over the last 30 years, they were all sorts of different shapes and sizes and had antennas and buttons and quirky as anything for about the first 20 years. And then after the iPhone came out in 2007, for the last 10 years, it has just been a screen. And the job now is to make the screen as big as possible and as thin as possible. So the screen, I think, is a crucial symbol in today's culture. In terms of origin and destination questions, these films imagine the world as being infinitely malleable and manipulatable to as far as you like. And that actually, for me, goes back to this cultural question of evolution and creation. The point of that story is not carbon dating and whether dinosaurs were in the Garden of Eden. The point of that story is about, as a cultural narrative, what is our origin and what has been given to us and what hasn't been given to us. If that's our origin, the world is infinitely malleable and the future is ours to create. We are free agents in the world without anchorage or tradition. That's an assumption within each of these films. And then praxis, what do? We transform the world with our technology, building solutions to make the impossible possible. That I think would be my quick analysis of that, but let's go forward. Someone who knew an awful lot about narrative and story was C.S. Lewis. Most of us know him because of his stories and because of his Christian apologetics. But in his secular work at Oxford, he wrote a book that he called the Oh Hell Book, which stands for the Oxford History of English Literature. And that was his kind of magnum opus. It's an absolute tome, and it lists all the English literature that has ever been. And he knew narrative like the back of his hand. And I want to read you a quote from a book that he wrote called Surprised by Joy, which is his description of his journey to faith. And he says this, having read loads and loads of narrative, being the expert on narrative, he read the Gospels and this is what he experienced. When I read the stories of sacrifice and heroism, stories of people sacrificing themselves for others, I am moved. It works on me. It suggests to me the way life really should be. And that's the job of a good story. You know, we want to be Luke Skywalker because he stands as a light in the darkness. And we leave the cinema going, that's what I want to stand as a light in the darkness. We want to be Katniss Everdeen because we want to stand up against corruption and violence. And so we read these stories and they move us, they do their work on us. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true, capital T, story, capital S, a myth. And he doesn't mean that in the sense of something that isn't true, clearly, because he just called it a true story. He means it in the sense of a part of the bedrock, the narrative that forms the foundations of our culture. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. As an expert of story, the reason C.S. Lewis moved towards theism and Christianity ultimately was because he looked at the gospel story, he looked at the story of Jesus and went, this is like the ultimate story, because it moves on me in the same way that all these other stories do in a kind of half-life way, but it really happened. Jesus is the hero who sacrifices himself unto death on our behalf so that we can be set free. And so, when we look at the story of Christianity, the incarnation, moving to the cross, the empty tomb, the giving of the Spirit, this is just obviously there's far more to this story than that, but that you see where I'm going with this, that what are the symbols of this narrative? What are the questions in terms of origin and destination and identity? What are the things that we're supposed to do when we live out this story? That's key questions for Christians in every generation. But I think it's particularly important for technologists and people who want to write code, is that as we're writing it, we're mindful of this story, and this is the story that shapes the things that we do and shapes the answers that we give to questions of origin and destiny. And it's this story that forms the symbolic world in which we live. One final quote from C.S. Lewis. There is something which unites magic and technology while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. So C.S. Lewis is trying to make the case here that magic, as we hear in stories, and technology as we interact with it today, actually has something in common. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality. So sages of ancient past saw reality and knew their soul within themselves, and their question was, how do I conform my soul to the world in which I see around me? And the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. If you want to conform yourself to the way the world really is, you need to change through learning more about yourself, through being virtuous, by developing those virtues and putting away those vices, and by being self-disciplined. For magic, and C.S. Lewis says, and for technology, which he called applied science, for magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men, and the solution is a technique. When the stories we tell and the culture we live in looks at the world around us and says, I'm going to change this through technology so that it does what I want, when we apply our will by force through technology so that it just happens like magic, I think we're in dangerous territory. But this is the offer, isn't it, of technology. I mean, it's funny, James and I were laughing about this before the meeting, because trying to get this Mac laptop to actually do what we wanted it to do, it didn't just work. It was actually really difficult. But when the cultural narrative around technology is, this thing will just work like magic, we're in dangerous territory. So, Final question for our time together. How should the gospel story inform the tech we create? Now that is essentially the question behind Kingdom Code, as I understand this movement that we're a part of. But I hope now, having spent an hour and a half thinking about it, this question is a bit kind of thicker and deeper and more resonant. How should the gospel story inform the tech we create? And as someone who is not a technologist, I wonder if one of the things we need to be aware of is we actually need to add friction into our technology rather than making a technology that's entirely frictionless. That actually the friction is a good thing. It's a blessing. It reminds us of the true story. So those are my thoughts on technology. Let's just break into groups and chat, and then depending on how much energy we've got, in maybe 10, 15 minutes, we can shout some questions. In 10 minutes, we're going to shout some questions around. Is that okay? Brilliant, thank you.
Hello. Okay, as you just draw your conversations to a close, we're just going to get to kind of grilling Jimmy in a second. But I just wanted to thank everyone who's kind of been involved in making tonight work really well. So first of all, thank you so much, Jimmy, for all that you have kind of done putting this together and really making us think. Thank you to Elliot behind the bar, who is an absolute pro. And this must have been quite strange, so thank you for kind of saying that. And also we've got Ed and I think it was Sophie, is that right? Yeah, Ed and Sophie, who have been actually filming this for us. So thank you to them as well. And finally, James Dock, who's over there, the man with the beard, who has he kind of runs the whole of Kingdom Code and does the stuff down in London, and he's been helping Alice and I put this all together. So thank you, James, for coming up and being such a great help for that.
So thank you, Alistair. You've done a great job.
Thank you. James has picked up all the moments when Alice and I have forgotten to do something. James has always been the one who's kind of stepped in there. So yeah, Jimmy, do you want to field some questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I might bounce it back to the floor because there's wisdom in the room. So we'll see where this conversation leads us. But statement, question. Yes.
I'll start with a statement. So one of the things that I see very clearly in how one of the big narratives is the idea of relationship, that we are made to be in relationship. You know, beginning of Genesis, it's not good for man to be alone. And that runs all the way through. So kind of with that practice of Christian living, how does what I build embody bringing people together rather than isolating them? So, for example, as a user of social media, does social media make me more isolated, or am I being more social in the real world as a result of it? So kind of one of the primary things that we as Kingdom Code do is on social media is we don't say, here's an interesting article to read. We say, come along to our events. And the reason for that is that we want to see the space of coming together at this forum and building relationship together as inherently biblical. We want to use that tool to then encourage relationship with God's people together. How about that? Brilliant.
But are you saying, James, then that relationship should be primarily physical, face-to-face? Or are there online ways that God's people can come together in relationship that don't involve us being in the same room?
Yes. I think that's a bigger question than perhaps we may have time for right this moment, because that is full of conversation. But I mean, it's interesting when you read letters like John writes 1, 2, and 3 John, kind of like at several points he goes, I've got so much I want to write to you, got so much I want to say to you, but I'm going to wait until I'm in person. Becomes the priority for that. So we're filming this, but you're going to get so much more out of being in this room than you would have if you just watched the video.
So someone else either respond to James or start a new topic.
So I've got an interest in just picking up on that, and this is going to sound like one of these kind of baby boomer whingy things, but it's not supposed to be like that. But it is.
Are you going to call us all snowflakes?
No. It's about like people go to like a concert and they film it, and it's like you're so busy filming it, you're not actually experiencing it. And I think that's where technology can be a problem. Is that just put it all down, just experience the moment that you're in. Because if you're too busy
DVD afterwards.
But to your point, watching the DVD afterwards is not as good as actually being there.
No.
And I think that's the thing. Sometimes people don't just simply just take the experience and just live that moment. And that's where technology I think can be about.
Because it turns out the HD in my eyes is actually pretty good.
And it's three-dimensional.
So in terms of habit and practice forms character and the JBKA Smith stuff around desiring the kingdom, I wonder what is happening to a culture that, because what the phone does is it detaches you from the moment that you're in.
Yeah.
You're no longer experiencing Coldplay, you're observing Coldplay, and there's a difference between those two things psychologically. And I wonder what happens when we develop the habit of observation rather than experience.
Yeah.
Hold on, Lawrence was first,
So
and then
I was going to suggest that my opinion is that social media isn't the problem, it's just a poor solution to a wider problem. That social isolation isn't about, because a product of social media is a product of people not working locally. People used to find community in their local workplace, in a union, in a local club, and all those things have kind of disappeared. And we're trying to fill the gap with social media, but because it's not face to face, because it's a curated life as well online, it's a faulty solution. But it can be part of the solution. I think it can. I think one of those things of the old small communities that were very local was they were very clear on who was the insider and the outsider. And now we're able to have friends, connect with people across the world. Yeah. Basically, I don't want to be dystopian or utopian about it.
Go on, sorry.
I think that's one interpretation of the filming of the thing. I think there's often, as all the things are more complicated. I was recently at my son's sports day, and my daughter's sports day. I filmed them because my wife wasn't there, and I wanted to show that, and I wanted to preserve memories. Was I not enjoying the experience? Damn right I was, right? I probably filmed badly because I was too busy shouting. You can't hear anything else except for my shouting, right? So I think there is an element. I think tarring one thing with one brush is a little careful, and the other aspect is I don't think anyone's filming it a show like that because they want to watch it later. That's not why people film it so they can share it, so they were there. Right? And there's a very interesting aspect talking about filling in the in-group and out-group. There's this virtue signalling that happens online, where in the curated life, as you mentioned, where actually for folks who've grown up in that environment, they actually, living your life is living it out there on the digital platform as well as here. There's a real blurring of what that means. I'm not saying that's healthy. I'm just saying the motivations are simpler than not enjoying it. I think you can also enjoy it, but there's this sort of wanting to capture the moment thing, and this also wants to say,
And I've noticed in myself, and I think I've noticed it in other people, that I don't, when I'm filming something, if I'm filming something I want to watch, so I was somewhere the other day and a kind of what they called flash mob choir turned up, so I wanted to film it. I didn't film it like this, I filmed it like that. And so I know that that would be a good enough picture, but I can still watch it.
Yeah.
And I've noticed other people do it, so no longer in front of the eyes, but just there, so I'm aware of it. And it's a very different process. But yeah, that's fascinating.
Someone at Glastonbury came on and said, I know you're going to want to record this, so do that. And people were like, oh wow, I can watch it and experience it at the same time.
Yeah.
And there was this whole thing going around saying it's changed how we're going to look at recording stuff.
And this is so, like, we're in our infancy with this stuff.
Yeah,
We're learning how to walk. Go on. Was there another hand of it?
Yeah. I'm going to continue that and then come up with a different thought. So that was, so with the video and stuff, I'm just thinking back to a Taylor Swift gig that I went to fairly recently, which is literally the best thing I've ever seen.
wow.
I know.
And you married.
So weird. Anyway,
We're all finished today.
yeah, it was, but it was on Netflix. Anyway, but watching the video for me actually was a way of kind of tapping into that experience kind of after the event. So like, I think there's also a level to which I engaged with it more by doing that, and I think I engaged with it better through the video that I took with the low resolution stuff and the terrible sound quality than I did from watching it on Netflix and being like, oh, it's the same show that I saw, because it was like revisiting that kind of perspective that I had and being like, oh, that was really cool. I really enjoyed that, and kind of almost reliving that. Back to the kind of gospel story and how that impacts this. We were talking in our group about the idea of like the kind of humanoid technology that you communicate with, and this idea of like trying to replicate kind of humanity, and that's kind of this idea that we're always trying to like shape technology around personhood. But actually, there's almost this kind of like dichotomy of technology where it could be that, but there's also this idea of augmenting the self. That like technology, like our smartphones are a part of who we are. They're almost like an extension of our being. And whether there's something about trying to perfect yourself or be the thing that you really want to be, or to kind of like get to that good place of, as a kind of like personal changing as a person, that maybe is a sort of like trying to replace almost what the craving is really asking for, which is Jesus and that relationship that with God and our Creator and the source of our being, that is actually going to take us to that place of being our real true selves through that kind of transformational process that can only come through knowing God. And whether technology is almost just a way to address that, or can be used as a way to address that perfection seeking.
Philosophically, what Al's touching on there is a movement called transhumanism or posthumanism, and philosophers within that group say things like the body is the original prosthesis, and as soon as it can be upgraded, it's our moral responsibility to do so. The body is the original prosthesis. It's just like you lose your leg and you need a new prosthetic leg. If you can upgrade that in 10 years' time to have a better leg, you should do that. Well, the body is just, the entire thing is just a prosthesis, and it should be upgraded as soon as possible. So posthumanism, transhumanism, it has its own cultural narrative, which is kind of not really hit mainstream culture yet, but you get inklings of it every now and then. Go on.
And if you want to read more about that, IVP have published a great book very recently called Transhumanism and the Image of God.
Yeah.
Which is worth a read.
Yeah. Do you want to say something? Yeah, you. Did you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I can, but I
responsibility of our closing thought.
We two discussions. One was, I think, a technologist's perspective on technology is sometimes different from a consumer's perspective on technology. I'm amazed anything works at all, in all seriousness.
Yes.
And so there is, I think, the marketing vision of technology solving our problems. I don't buy it, and I don't believe it, and when people say AI will solve us, I'm like, I have a PhD in AI, and I'm like, okay, which particular field of AI are you talking about here? Like, there's just so much nuance, and of course people don't understand, and I'm like, it's not going to do what you think it's going to do. So, but the other thing was that the best example I know of I guess, gospel-centered technology is actually, and I mentioned this, what the CAP guys have written, they built their own system because no one else wants to tackle this problem because there's no money in it, of tracking clients' debt and making payments and savings and all that kind of stuff and process, and tracking the creditors and how much you paid and so on and so forth. Custom system that's got to be regulated, right? Because it's dealing financial transactions and debt and all this stuff. And no one else is going to build that, so they went and built it themselves.
Yeah.
And called Grace and Hope, yeah, the system. And I think that's a fantastic example of, I mean, it's a cost to them, they're a charity, right? IT's expensive, yet they did this, and I think that's a wonderful example of where actually you're writing standard kind of business code stuff, so payments integration, reporting, all that kind of stuff you would do, but it's actually saving lives. I mean, you guys do it, but I went to visit CAP and look at their systems a while back, and I was really blown away by that, because I think it's a really great example of where there's a human need, and technology can really help, and a bunch of people got together and they did it.
And this is so, I was sort of saying this to Al earlier, like the deconstructing cultural narratives is worth doing, it's important I think, and this sort of analysis is good, but you can't live in a deconstructed house. Eventually you have to construct something, you have to put forward a narrative that will generate a culture that you want to see, and that's one of the reasons I like Kingdom Code as a movement, is because we don't just drink together and think together, we also build together, and building code that has something to do with this narrative is a culture generating thing based out of a narrative that we think is God-given and healthy and good for the world, and so that's let's do more of that.
And so, like, to build on that, we set the challenge for Build 2 years ago, and various projects kind of sprung up over the Build weekend, and the one that we kind of gave an award to at the end of the weekend was a VR experience of what life as a debt client would be like, and a brilliant way of kind of, I guess, bringing a reality of someone else's life and empathy of what life in the UK could be like for people who are hidden mostly behind closed doors, who you never see this life. I was shocked that there are people with no food, no beds, no furniture, properly destitute people in our country. We just don't know about it. But as a way of kind of building a connection between groups of people who would never know anything about each other's lives, it was a great use of technology. Knocked up in what, 2 days, 3 days, whatever. 2 days, yeah. And we then used that last summer or the summer before, I can't remember which, around exhibition stands in the UK on Christian festivals, to kind of, as part of kind of giving people an insight into our work. So it's a plug for Build, right?
That's a really nice segue.
So thanks. First of all, thank you, Jimmy, for that. Briefly on the topic of thank yous, I also forgot to thank Boxhead. We have a representation from Boxhead here for putting up some to help us out with this event, and that has just been really appreciated. They effectively paid for all the drinks, so it's good. But yes, so Build is, as we were kind of talking, Build is happening in October. Is that? Yeah. I can't remember the exact date. The 10th of October. And it's effectively a hackathon happenstand in London.
By 10th, I mean
11th. I was going to say.
Off by 1 hour. So
that's example, right?
It'll be across a sort of 2-day period as well, I guess.
11th, 12th.
Yeah. It's a hackathon. We kind of stayed up all night, optionally all night, but for a long time, and we build a solution to a problem. And there's going to be 2 challenges that are proposed.
Can I just speak a little bit to that? Actually?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
One of the things with Build is that we're really keen that Build has a huge range of different skill sets available. So kind of Build is not just for the developers. Build is for the designers, for the project managers, for the database administrators, for the people who are interested in VR, for the people who are interested in, actually, I've just got an idea and I want to see it built for the kingdom. So so kind of the idea is that we spend 24 hours together. We're inviting 2 mission agencies to come and basically share some of the work that they're doing, some of the problems that they're facing, the challenges that they've got, and we're going to have 24 hours, as Jimmy said, just to start thinking about this, to start applying this kind of stuff to what we do with the skill sets that God has given us. So yeah, build is basically a chance for us to really put our foot down and go, right, okay, let's not just talk and think about stuff, let's apply it. It'd be amazing if a crew from Leeds came along. I was really serious actually when I said about the idea of relationship being important, and actually there's something really relational forming about going, actually, no, we're going to build some stuff together, we're going to work together, we're going to do this. So build 11th of October, and then the next event, I'll let you speak to that maybe.
Yeah, so the next event that we're going to have in Leeds will probably be in September, and it'll be looking forward to build, thinking about the challenges that have been proposed, and coming up with some ideas for things that we might want to do kind of when we get there, just to get that kind of prepared and ready. But there'll be more about that through all the kind of channels and stuff.
Even if you can't make build itself, the ideation evening is a really interesting kind of way. We're going to do a design sprint. If you've not done a design sprint, that is it's a 5-day project that we're going to try and condense into 2 hours. That's worth coming along to see that kind of magic happen. Yeah, that really is magic.
Magic from before the dawn.
Time would be what we do.
Great.